More than 2 decades in the waiting, an admission from Fujitsu that its accounting system was doomed from the start. So too the sub-postmasters and mistresses whose lives were destroyed following accusations of theft. All because of bugs in its Horizon software that it and the post office knew about all along.
As a company, for the last couple of years, it has known of the existence of these bugs, errors and defects at a corporate level.
Yes, in fact, all the bugs and errors have been known at one level or not for many, many years, right from the very start of deployment of this system. There were bugs and errors and defects which were well known to all parties, actually.
Not only did Fujitsu's Europe chief tell the inquiry the post office had been told of errors, he said that information was taken out of witness statements by the post office in order to prosecute sub-postmasters.
No doubt you would regard that as shameful.
Yes, that would be one word I would use.
What's the other one?
Shameful, appalling. My understanding of how our laws work in this country, that all of the evidence should have been put in front of the sub-postmaster, that the post office was relying on to prosecute them.
Today we heard that Fujitsu had identified several bugs in the system from the very beginning. Bugs that Paul Patterson said were shared with the post office over the next 2 decades. Now, as those bugs were described one by one in the inquiry, the sub-postmasters listening to his evidence shook their heads in recognition and anger. One of them was Mark Kelly. He ran the same local post office in Swansea as his parents had before him, but he's also a computer specialist and a whistleblower who spotted one of these bugs. His warnings were ignored. He was accused of stealing by the post office, lost his job, home, and was hospitalised after a mental health breakdown. How frustrating was it to know that information for fact and not be able to speak about it publicly, for it to be suppressed?
For me, going back, once I become more mentally aware, I became very depressed. I felt guilty from it all. I took a lot of the blame from it. I felt, I don't know if I can say it, suicidal from it.
Fujitsu has apologised for its flawed system and the flawed data it produced for the post office's prosecutions, more than 900 of them. When asked why it took until this week to promise compensation, Paul Patterson said Fujitsu had let the sub-postmasters and society down, that it had a moral obligation to pay, one so long in the waiting.
Well, earlier I spoke to Ian Henderson from Second Sight Forensic Accountants, who were called in by the post office to investigate. They uncovered all sorts of issues back in 2015, including system flaws and prosecutions which appeared to be motivated by recovering losses, all claims rejected by the post office, which by then had terminated their contract. Well, I started by asking Mr. Henderson what first alerted him to what was happening to the sub-postmasters.
As soon as we realised that sub-postmasters were not in control of their own branch accounts and that a third party, in this case Post Office or Fujitsu, could directly manipulate the data and recover losses from sub-postmasters for which they were not responsible.
And armed with that knowledge, just as a human being, let alone as a forensic accountant, why didn't you just shout it from the rooftops?
We were subject to a non-disclosure agreement with Post Office. We were allowed to talk to MPs.
And you still are?
And we still are. So I'm limited in what I can say. I can only talk about what's in the public domain. But we were very frank with members of Parliament. We had a number of meetings with members of Parliament. Unfortunately, a lot of our disclosure was in February, March 2015, which was only a few months before a general election. And therefore MPs were perhaps not as effective as they could have been. They had to focus on other matters.
Now, you ended up having your contract terminated by the post office. You were sacked.
Yes.
Why?
We got too close to discovering matters that were likely to embarrass Post Office.
The truth?
The truth. I mean, we were starting to look at suspense accounts. We were starting to look at balances that had been taken to the profit of Post Office. And we felt that at least part of those balances may be due to sub-postmasters, so that in effect, Post Office was benefiting from the funds that they were recovering from sub-postmasters.
Is it not just one massive cover-up by the Post Office?
It certainly has a lot of those characteristics.
Those characteristics being in terms of your personal professional experience. You deal with people all the time. This must have been a completely different order.
The discussion I had with, and I had many discussions over a number of weeks with Post Office, their main focus was on protecting the brand. They were very proud of the fact that Post Office had been in existence for 400 years. It was the nation's most trusted brand, and so on, were stories that they were constantly telling us about. I felt that there was a cover-up within Post Office. They wanted to shut us down. They wanted to shut down the interests of MPs. They wanted to prevent the truth coming out.
You said, look, there is a problem with this system. There is a problem. It doesn't work. You looked them in the eye. What did they say?
Depends on what level we were talking to. We were dealing with a project manager at Post Office. I won't name him, but he was very helpful and he shared our concerns. The higher up in the organisation, certainly at board level or chief executive level, that's where we started hitting the problems. And I felt it was a cover-up by Post Office. We
now know that the Post Office was so worried about their case against the sub-postmasters, they informed their insurers back in 2013, and they stopped prosecuting people in 2014. What does that tell us?
Well, the reason they stopped prosecuting in 2014 was we were involved in our investigations at that stage. We disclosed to Post Office the evidence that we were finding, and I think they realised that it was not sensible to continue prosecuting. So I think that dealt with that issue.
In terms of justice, we have now a degree of truth at long last about what happened, in no small measure because of your organisation, Second Sight. What does justice look like for these postmasters now?
Ideally put back in the position that they would have been in without any of this happening, in other words, restitution. Just writing out a big cheque isn't going to do that. It's not going to cut the mustard, I feel. Certainly talking to individual sub-postmasters, you know, they've gone through hell. They've you know, lost relationships, lost family members. We need to do a lot more than is being done at the moment, and just writing out a big cheque isn't going to solve the problem.
So what is a lot more beyond just money?
I'm not sure. Certainly a public admission, not just a half-hearted apology, which is what seems to be the case at the moment, but a real recognition of the harm that has occurred over many, many years, and some form of restitution.
Ian Henderson there. Well, in response to that interview, a Post Office spokesman told us, we fully share the aims of the current public inquiry set up to get to the truth of what happened in the past and accountability. It's for the inquiry to reach its own independent conclusions after consideration of all the evidence on the issues it is examining.